I've been in Rhode Island State Trooper for 6 years now. And I think one of the worst investigations I've ever been a part of was actually one of my first. I guess it hit me harder because I was such a rookie. Alana guy say the first bad ones are like that. But most of those guys got closure. I didn't. It started out with a fatal traffic accident on Highway 1 out near Narragansett. Some idiot on a motorcycle had been driving the wrong way down a highway, and it smashed right into a mother of 3 coming the other way. Scattered, and both like Jimmy saw over the road. Since the investigating officer was tied up with a ton of paperwork, me and my superior officer had to go deliver the news of the motorcyclist's death to the next of kin. Only from what I heard, it wasn't your average case of death by dangerous driving. At some point, the motorcyclist banged up and began driving the opposite way. He might have been drunk or high, we wouldn't have known until toxicology came back. But the crash investigator had noticed something very strange. Although the guy was caught a few miles back doing around 70, the CSI said that there was no way that he'd hit the woman's car doing anything less than $190. He'd seen plenty of head-on collisions in the 70s range. And this wasn't one of them. The damage to both the front end of the sedan as well as the motorcycle itself was completely catastrophic. And our investigator figured that it was some kind of crazy way of taking their own life. Take someone with me as I go kind of deal. Either way, we still had to go to deliver the news. And we had to do it in a way befitting the occasion, you know, no mention of him taking his own life, smashing into the mom, nothing like that. It took the coroner a while to get an ID on a biker, but in the end, got one. And in turn, we got the address of the house that he shared with his wife and kid. The address came back as a match to this big old house in an upscale neighborhood. So we drove over in the early evening to try and make sure that someone would be home at our time of calling. Now looking back, this is the first part that really started to raise some alarm bells. Usually speaking, if a person dies in a car accident in the early hours in the morning, someone reports them missing a few hours later. It's usually a family member, girlfriend or boyfriend who worries about their unusually tardy worker, but sometimes it's the person's employer. We might not find a body until after this report has been made. But this makes identifying a body much easier because then we can just draw from the list of recently reported missing persons. I'm not saying we never get cases where a person has no one report them missing that happens to, and it's sad as hell. But they tend to be homeless people, drug addicts, and sometimes old folks. People unfortunate enough to be on the bottom rungs of society due to sheer bad luck or their own dumb decisions. But then they have some wealthy suburban father died in an accident and not a single person reports them missing. Something's going on. We see 2 cars parked in the driveway. So we're 99% sure someone is home. But when we rang the doorbell, there was no answer. And this happens more than you think. A person might be taking a bath wearing headphones doing yard work out back or have some other perfectly innocent reason for not coming to the door. So a standard procedure, we went walking around the property looking for any sign of her bikers, wife or kids. After finding an unlocked side gate that led into the backyard, we walked up onto this rear porch type thing that had big glass windows, which looked into the home's kitchen. Everything looked exactly how it should be, except over near the refrigerator where all kinds of food items were lying neatly on the floor like little audience members. I pointed it out to my sergeant who was busy checking one of the home side windows. And he peered through the glass for a second or two before taking a step back, using a stretched out arm to bring me with him. He then ordered me to radio dispatch that we had probable cause to force our way into the home, which took me by surprise because I sure as hell didn't see what he was seeing to make him think that. Still, I did as I was told, while my surgeon put his boot to the door until it finally broke open and kind of embarrassed to admit it. But it took me that long to see what he had been seeing. Or I think a better way to put it would be to ask the question that he had asked himself. Why would someone just empty their fridge out like that? The whole shebang, to even the glass shelves and the plastic drawer, because they wanted to put something big inside of it. Something real big that they needed to keep from turning often and sticking up the place. I'll give you one good guess as to what that thing was. We pulled his wife's body out of the fridge and his infant daughter's side of the freezer. Both had been beaten to a pulp, strangled, and then folded up like pretzels before he stuffed them in there, like they didn't matter at all to him. By then, we had a good idea of what had happened. And collecting evidence just felt like a pointless formality. The guy killed his family. And then he went to off himself because he couldn't live with the guilt. It was an open and shut case on the surface. But two things didn't sit right with any of the investigating officers. Number one, the guy had no record, not even so much as a speeding ticket. He also had zero history of mental health issues. Friends and family said the guy didn't have a violent bone in his body. And nothing in his or his wife's cell phone suggested that they had been arguing or even that the relationship had been remotely strained. Number two, when we spoke to family and friends, it became clear that not a single person in our biker's life knew that he even had a motorcycle, not even his bank. We figured it was a recent purchase, as how the hell do you hide a motorcycle? But when we gained access to the guy's bank account statements from the previous 2 years, that was nothing. We checked his checking accounts, his personal savings account, even the joint account that he shared with his late wife, but again, nothing. This meant that he probably paid for the bike with cash or was given it as a sort of gift. More importantly, why keep it a secret? And number three, the third point of sort of contention, and probably the weirdest of all, was that our biker might have actually known the woman who smashed into this didn't come out until way after the case was closed. And it was all down to the work of a private investigator hired by the woman's surviving husband. But apparently, our biker and the mom of three had worked in the same Manhattan office building during the late 2000s, had only been for a brief period of 3 or 4 months. And since they worked on different floors, for different companies, there's no evidence that they ever interacted with our biker slams into a woman on a dark stretch of highway. And it just so happens to be a person that he might have shared an elevator with. I'm not saying that there's something there. But I also wouldn't rule out that there was some kind of connection, which is exactly what the department did. Even if we did get answers to some of these questions, and there was something deeper going on. It's not like we could prosecute a dead guy, you know. So that's where we were left with things completely in limbo, no closure whatsoever for anyone involved. All that stuff still really plays on my mind. And I guess only 4 or 5 years have passed, but I get the feeling those questions are going to stay with me for a long, long time. But such is life, I guess. Closure is a rare thing. And time isn't the healer. People make it out to be. During the early years of my career as a sheriff deputy, there was this one investigation that became incredibly unsettling, and that it stayed with me all these years later. We received a call about a young person sleeping in a car at the end of a dirt road. And the owner of the property mentioned that technically, the individual was trespassing. But he didn't want to report it that way. He expressed concern that the young person seemed distressed and might need someone to check on them. So that's what I did. I drove out to the location where the young person's car was, and when I say young person, they were probably in their late teens, early 20s. When I found the car, I checked the license plate to see if any information came up. As it turned out, that young person was reported as missing, and the car belonged to their extremely worried mother. This discovery provided some reassurance, and I believed that I would likely be able to convince them to go back home. If they were cooperative, I would simply let them continue on their way. However, if they decided to be difficult, I could detain them for trespassing. Either way, I thought the problem would be resolved. I approached this person's car slowly and noticed them reclined all the way back in the front passenger seat. I gently tapped on the window, keeping my hand close to my sidearm as they woke up by nature, to greet them with a friendly smile and a playful wakey wakey buddy. Do you mind if we have a little? I didn't finish my sentence, because I realized that that young person wasn't paying attention. Their eyes widened to the point where it seemed like they might pop out of their head, and I watched the color drained from their face before I suddenly saw a gun in their hand. Instinctively, my training kicked in. I swiftly moved back while drawing my own weapon. I shouted, drop the gun," repeatedly. And it all happened too quickly for me to fully comprehend what I was witnessing. But in one fluid motion, they bit down on the barrel, pulled the trigger, and took their own life. Still trembling from the rush of adrenaline, I waited for backup and EMTs to arrive in an attempt to save that young person's life. But unfortunately, there wasn't anything I could do. They were pronounced dead at the scene and fell upon me to deliver the heartbreaking news to their mother. That was one of the most difficult tasks I have ever faced, and it left me shaken for quite some time. Unfortunately, everything I've shared so far, as weighty as it was, is not the reason why I am constantly reminded of what had happened. As the information I learned afterward, that truly terrified me. I managed to obtain a copy of this person's missing person report, which essentially contained all the details their mother provided on the day they went missing. She said she woke up in the middle of the night and smelled smoke. She got out of bed and quickly discovered the smoke was coming from a trash can fire in her backyard. She went downstairs, filled a bucket of water, and then threw it over the fire to extinguish the flame. Then, correctly assuming that it was her son who started the fire, she went looking for him to confront him. And that's when she discovers that not only is her child missing, but her car is missing, too. She dials 911 to report a missing right away. And later that morning, she starts trying to figure out what her child then burning. It was his computer. And from the looks of it, a bunch of his clothes too. They were all severely burned, so not easily recognizable. But a quick check of his bedroom was enough to figure out what was missing. I learned all that when I delivered the bad news. And when the mother had shared everything she possibly could with me, she was incredibly brave. By the way, she asked, what should I do next? Since there was no evidence of any crime being actually committed, and the decision was essentially hers. I told her that if I were in her shoes, I would try to recover the data from his computer's hard drive, if possible, as it would likely provide some clue as to why her son did what he did. And apart from that, I had no idea what I would do in her position to lose a child like that. And such sudden and mysterious circumstances. I can't even imagine the pain that must have been. So in the end, all I could do was tell her to call me if she needed anything and offered her my deepest condolences. Months passed and I handled hundreds of other calls. And the story of that kid faded into the background of my thoughts. And then one day, the mother called me with some news. In the immediate aftermath of her son's death, one of the first things she needed to do was have her car cleaned. Obviously, a private company was hired to do the job with instructions to put everything that wasn't too bloodstained into a large black duffel bag so the mother could sort through it later. It took her a while to get around to it, knowing that most of the stuff would be the clutter that had been lying around her car. But when she finally got to it, she found an old menu flyer from some diner up in Oregon. She had never been to Oregon. And as far as she knew, neither had her son, so she was obviously confused. Then on the back, there were 2 phone numbers, one for a fixed landline and one for a cell phone. She called the fixed landline first to find it disconnected, but after typing it into Google, she found out it was registered to some shipping company that claimed to be permanently closed. Then she tried calling the cell phone number, and this time, the line started to ring and someone eventually answered. She said the person sounded male, older with some kind of accent. And then when she mentioned her son, the person hung up on her. She tried calling back, but the phone wouldn't ring. And she tried again later, but it was disconnected. She appeared convinced that the secretive man and the bankrupt shipping company had some involvement in her son's death. And if her account is true, I can't blame her at all. However, since there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, our department couldn't take any action. Unlike our initial conversation, I wasn't as eager to suggest a private investigator this time. Whatever she had discovered, it was significant and dangerous, and she was clearly in over her head. I used to believe that the uncertainty would be her downfall, but I later realized that uncovering the truth might also be fatal for her. If he forced me to choose from all the unusual calls I've attended, I think I'd have to pick this one. We received a call reporting a 911 incidents of domestic violence. Both the woman and her husband were injured. And although the worst was over, she needed some officers to come over and get him, quote, unquote. My partner and I ended up being those two officers. Now, when you mention domestic violence incident, people usually have a specific idea of what that entails. Cops show up, a couple argues, maybe throws things at each other, we intervene, separate them, and that's the end of it. Now, don't get me wrong, that exact scenario happens quite often. But domestic violence incidents can be as unique and diverse as the people involved, both as investigators and victims, not to emphasize it too much, but you never know what you're arriving at. You simply have to handle it on a case-by-case basis. So during this particular call, we arrived at the given address only to find a woman in her late 50s. Sitting on the porch. She's holding frozen peas wrapped in a towel against her split lip. But apart from that injury, she seems fine, and the incident appears to be over. We're still somewhat tense as we inquire about her husband's whereabouts. But when she responds with not anymore, we start to relax a bit. Sometimes a couple is separated and not living together. And the aggressive party simply flees when the other person calls the police. We assume it was that kind of situation and ask if there's any chance that the husband might return soon. She informs us that she's pretty sure that he won't come back in her exact words. As a result, when we become obviously more at ease and accept her offer to come inside for something to drink? No, obviously, we decline anything that she offers, but we take a seat in the couch and begin asking the standard questions. Has he hit her before that she feel her life is in danger? Where could he have gone? And throughout the entire interaction, something that truly surprised me was how happy and carefree the woman appeared to be. I assumed it was a sort of bravery in the face of this adversity. Some women and girls aren't in any condition to answer questions following a violent incident involving a boyfriend or spouse. Sometimes they're too frightened to speak. Other times they're emotionally or physically unable. However, sometimes, when they finally summon the courage to end their suffering, it's as if a tremendous burden has been lifted off them. And instead of fear or sadness or regret, they experience peace. Now, once again, I assumed that that's what we were dealing with. And she answered our questions calmly and to the best of her ability. Yeah, he had hit her before. No, she didn't feel like she was in danger. But when it came to where he might have gone, her reply immediately struck me as odd. All of her answers had been direct and to the point, and when asked where she thought her husband was now, she replied, "Well, I don't know. I don't think it's for me to say." I remember how my partner was reading something when she said it and how he suddenly froze mid-word to look back up at her. Now, we might have been uniform back then. But we weren't naive, and we weren't inexperienced. So when the woman's answers suddenly became evasive and indirect, we knew to pursue that line of questioning until there was nothing left. Not doing so could mean missing out on some crucial investigative detail. We asked her to explain what she meant by our last answer, and then repeated the original question and asked her to tell us exactly what her husband was. She just sighed, took a sip of her iced tea, and then pointed to the ceiling. We then asked her to confirm that her husband was upstairs, and she nodded. We asked if he was hiding and if he was armed. She shook her head and told us he's in the bathtub. We went upstairs, pushed open the doors to the bathroom. And there was the husband, or at least what was left of him anyway. A double-barrel shotgun was leaning against the tub, and what remained of the husband's head and shoulders were dripping off one of the walls. One detail I'll never forget is a section of the husband's face was lying there on the tiles looking up at us. It wasn't much, just a chunk of cheek with half a nostril still attached. But there was reminding me that at the end of the day, we're all just bags of raw meat and bone. When we walked back into the TV room downstairs, the woman told us that we didn't have to worry. She knew that she was going to spend the rest of her life in prison, or had at least accepted that was a possibility, and was prepared to come quietly before offering a full confession. She asked if she could finish the last of her iced tea. And when I told her I couldn't allow her to do that, she did it anyway before saying, "And I swear on my child's eyes." "What are you going to do, officer? Arrest me?" I can laugh looking back on it. But at the time, I was too stunned to do anything but stare at her. She held out her wrist for the handcuffs. And the week or so afterward, I was 99% sure that she was headed to prison for the rest of her life. And I didn't have the whole backstory, and neither was I an attorney. And then last part may indicate that my explanation may not be as clear as that of a lawyer. But you can research these details yourself to resolve any uncertainties. I'm sure that considering your familiarity with true crime material, you're acquainted with the battered wife defense and how it has led to abused wives receiving no prison time if their defense can prove they suffered from battered spouse syndrome. Well, all the attorneys representing this woman had to do was refer to the previous emergency calls that they had made over the years both in Florida and Alabama, resulting in their sentences being completely overturned by the Court of Appeals. And by completely overturned, I mean their convictions were erased and they were compensated for their time that they served. The husband's criminal record was so severe that the state compensated this woman for the inconvenience of being arrested. And from what I heard, it's remarkable that she even survived long enough to kill him. I heard she went to live with distant relatives. Once everything was resolved, individual she hadn't communicated with yours. I hope she's doing well and was able to spend the rest of her life in peace, surrounded by people who genuinely loved her. Having been compelled to take a life myself, I understand the weight that it carries. You ponder whether you could have acted differently or whether God will comprehend it. But in her case, I get the feeling that she was able to sleep like a baby. After all, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I used to work for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office here in Alabama. And this one time, we got a call about a guy with a knife walking up and down outside his house, threatening anyone who passed by. We show up, the guy's barefoot and in his underwear, and is clearly going through some kind of psychological episode. We're trained to de-escalate. But that's hard enough at the best of times. Even with right-thinking people throw a little mania into the mix and well, things get unpredictable. We pull up and get out of the car. I've got the lethal well, my partner has the non-lethal when we start trying to begin a dialogue with our suspect, as per de-escalation training. The guy is completely off the rails though, ranting and raving about his ex-wife and their deceased child. My partner is getting all sympathetic with the guy, asking him to put his knife down so they could talk about what Adam's so upset. And for a minute there, he seemed to calm down a little. But then, the next thing we knew, he was totally manic again, barking out all this racist stuff about his neighbors and how they were trying to kill him. And once again, we tried our best to talk them down while keeping our distance. Knowing that a man of his size could potentially inflict a single fatal stab wound. He was at least 6'2" older, but wiry and fueled by adrenaline. Obviously, he would be able to close the distance between us in seconds. Unfortunately, he didn't seem to have a direct problem with us. And I quickly got the impression that if he were to stab someone, they probably wouldn't be me or my partner. Little did I know how right I was going to be witnessing, and happiness, something that has stayed with me crystal clear in my memory for almost 20 years now. I remember the guy's voice shifting from angry and manic to tired and somewhat sad as he asked us if he would have to go to jail. We were honest with him because, as the saying goes, honesty is always the best policy. If you lie to someone in that state, though, insists like a mule that you are trying to put the cuffs on them. And the best approach is to talk to them as though you're on their side. Explaining that going to jail is actually what won't get them out of the volatile situation they've gotten themselves into. They might respond saying things like, I can't go to jail. But often that's just the denial phase of accepting that they're about to be arrested. My partner and I tried to guide the person through it, suggested that they could be back out in hours, and then if they couldn't secure a bail, they might receive credit for time served due to not having actually harmed anyone. I honestly thought this approach would bring him back down to earth. He was already calming down. I believed that knowing that he wouldn't face severe consequences would allow us to cut them without a struggle. However, instead of surrendering, the man looked at us with this really sad expression and said, I'm sorry, and then plunged the knife into his own neck. It felt like time slowed for a second or two as he did it. Initially, he held the knife facing downwards, his authority, been preparing to stab someone on the sort of downward thrust. But then came the moment that he stopped, looked at the knife and flipped it 180 degrees before gripping it tightly with both hands. He could see him trying to find the will to do it, trembling slightly before he drove it into his neck, and both my partner and I were shouting, "Don't do it. Don't do it," but it was futile. However, it wasn't just that he stabbed himself in his own neck, nor the sound that it made, the sort of sick crunches he tore through the tough tissue in his throat. It was the fact that he pulled the knife out and did it again. My partner reacted before I could, using his stun gun to incapacitate the man before rushing over to control the bleeding. The worst part was watching him wait a few seconds for the stun gun to lose its charge before attempting to cover the wounds. As you can probably imagine, it didn't bring much success. Blood was literally squirting out from between my partner's fingers. And I don't think the man survived for more than a few minutes before my partner abandoned his attempts to stop the bleeding. He was pronounced dead at the scene. And by the time the EMTs arrived, the man looked like a ghost. If it weren't for the blood covering him, he would have been as pale as a sheath. He sort of laid there motionless, his eyes wide open as he tried to prevent the rest of the neighborhood from gathering around and taking pictures. There's something else you never get over. I understand the desire to know what's happening in your own neighborhood. But for people to take out their cell phones and start recording this man's final moments, that's something I can never comprehend. These videos end up online, watched by hundreds of thousands of people. It turns the worst day of someone's life for their final moments into some sort of spectacle, something to stare at through a screen before leaving a comment and moving on. I can't think of anything more disgusting, even if I tried. For almost 2 years in my life, I worked undercover in the Pacific Northwest. My job was to infiltrate a ring of narco traffickers who were bringing in heroin and medical-grade methamphetamine from Southeast Asia. They had a whole network of shipping routes that were lubricated with bribes supposedly facilitated by the Burmese military. But that was not my concern. My job was to siphon off information from their stateside operations with a view to bring them down completely. The first phase of the operation involves choking off their finances. So intercepting shipments and hitting bagmen, that kind of thing. Putting pressure on an organization like that makes them nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. But experienced drug traffickers also recognized when the cop seems to be getting a little too lucky and apprehending their employees. And they seem to begin to smell a rat. This is the part that makes my job extremely difficult and extremely stressful. In that kind of environment, an undercover officer is subject to purity test after purity test. And given that we're often a new member of the crew, we're put under an intense amount of scrutiny. But the good news is, if you keep your cool and play your character, there's almost no way for a person to work out who you really are. I understand that in undercover work, things happen. And in the past, people have been absolutely on their guard and still been pegged as a rat. But for me, I always thought of it as algebra, a little x plus a little y, and I got to go home that day. Don't think about it, just stick to the formula. As things got more and more intense within the organization, the bosses turned to more and more extreme measures to root out informants. One time, they taught a bunch of the guys that big meets were going down at different times and in different places. I had no idea that it was a trap, passed the information on my handlers, and they sent a small surveillance team to stake out the location. By some miracle, one of the guys ends up getting picked up on an old warrant, but the boss says, got it into their heads that the arrest was so just to cover. The arrestee didn't make it out of the county jail alive. And that took some heat off of me for a while, and the operation cooled off for a little bit to give the impression that the rat had been found. But then slowly but surely, the work ramped up again, and with it, sort of the risks. The top enforcer of the crew I'd infiltrated was a guy who called himself Rip, and everyone was terrified of Rip. He was frightening enough at the best of times. He was usually him who was charged with tying up loose ends and making problems disappear. But since he had been tasked with sniffing out the rat, he and the bosses had become incredibly paranoid. All sorts of people started turning up dead in various places. Some individuals were taken to a trailer in the middle of nowhere for what Rip referred to as a background check. And that would vanish for a few days and then reappear with blank eyes, sporting bruises, or bandages. Rip and his crew would essentially torture people if they were unsatisfied with the answers to the questions, hoping to uncover the rat that way. I was terrified of being chosen, so I tried to maintain my best behavior. However, in the end, I was singled out due to being new, and I was driven out to the trailer to meet Rip. The TV and dining area of the trailer looked as ordinary as ever. But when it was led into the other room, I realized that it had undergone a drastic transformation. What used to be a bedroom had become a fully equipped torture chamber, and I was its next victim. The only comforting thought that I had was that if I could endure this, I might require hospital treatment, but I wouldn't be killed. Surviving this latest round of purity tests would greatly benefit me within the organization. Before any questions were asked, I was instructed to sit in the chair position in the center of the room. As I complied, one of Grip's men removed my shirt, tied my wrists and ankles, and then poured a bottle of water over my head. Initially, I had no idea what was happening. But as I blanked the water out of my eyes and saw the taser in Rip's hand, I realized their intentions. The sickest part was that they zapped me with the taser a few times, the water amplifying the shocks just to test my resilience. The question hadn't even begun, and they were torturing me for their own amusement. Reflecting on it now, I believe their aim was to make me believe that whatever was to come would be far worse than the warm-up they had subjected me to. I kept waiting for them to start asking questions, but they didn't. And said, Rip approached me, pulled out a photograph from his jacket pocket and showed it to me. It was a picture of my mom. That kind of terror is more akin to a physical sensation. And it was something I didn't have to pretend. I had become so accustomed to talking my way out of situations. But seeing that photograph left me stunned into a terrified silence. Rip informed me that they had the ability to locate anyone. If I admitted to being the rat, they promised me a quick death, ensuring my mom's safety. However, if I continued to lie, they would show me a video of her torture and murder, before subjecting me to the same fate. What else can I do? If I told them the truth, I knew they'd kill her too. It was all just a trick to get me to fess up. Hell, they probably already knows me, hence why they've gone to all the trouble of tracking down my family. I had to continue to lie. I had to stick to my formula. So I did. I lied, and lied, and lied some more. I tried to totally derail the conversation by claiming I hadn't talked to her in years, and that I'd pay him to tell me where she was. I put everything I had into that little speech, throwing in a little about not being a goddamn rat, but mostly focusing on pouring all my raw emotion into my completely improvised mommy issues tale. And it worked. Rip said that when they found the rat, he told me where they'd found her. But for the time being, I was to remember what they could do to her. If they found out it was me funneling info to the cops. After that, they let me go. And my handlers had to talk me down from wanting to call it quits on the entire operation. They promised they move my mom into temporary protection and that I'd be safe to continue the work at hand. And then do another goddamn thing until I had spoken to her and had her bitching down the phone to me about the crappy motel my handlers had her staying in. And that was about a year into the operation. And then 6 months later, it was all over. But in that time, I had none nightmares of watching my own mom snuff video almost every single night. Once the operation was concluded, and about 60% of the organization was looking at long-term sentences, I got access to the entire case file. And that's how I discovered that I wasn't the only insider helping to bring the whole thing down. The FBI had a confidential informant inside the organization. And although the reports didn't name the CI, based on reports, I think I have a pretty good idea who it was. The CI was apparently high up in the organization's security apparatus and had been integral in the group's effort to rid itself of informants. The very same person passing highly sensitive information to the cops had been charged with finding himself. It was a genius level 40 chess move from the FBI. And it resulted in almost everyone in the group being either suspected or accused. All except one, the guy everyone was afraid of, Rip. I think the FBI had access to my file and got themselves a picture of my mom, then gave it to Rip to boost his own authenticity, as well as my credibility. They knew I'd get my mom to safety and that their CI wouldn't make good on his threats if he wanted to avoid a jail cell. Speaking of which, of the handful of ground-level guys that managed to escape the mass arrests that mark the opposite conclusion, guess who was among them? That's right, Rip. I knew it was pointless to accuse them of any malfeasance. They would just deny that Rip was their CI and deny providing any photographs to the man inside. Cross-agency cooperation is bad enough at the best of times, let alone when you're flinging around some pretty serious accusations. In the end, I had two choices: accuse the FBI and potentially ruin my career, or shut my mouth, soak up the glory, and keep moving my career forward to the point where no one could pull that kind of crap on me again. Now I work financial crimes, and Taco Man had my own task force for a while to both cushy jobs I earned from putting my ass on the line over and over again. For guys who saw me as little more than a pawn in a grand game of chess. You go into policing with this idea that you're going to make a difference. But given long enough, you realize you're just an extra in a movie that goes on and on and on, until there's no one left to watch it anymore.